A bespectacled gray-haired woman appears on screen. A moderator's name appears against a black background. Elizabeth Kramer.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll be getting started in just a minute here.
A slide title appears, Action for Child Protection, Risk and Safety Assessment 101. On the right side of the slide, a child's cupped hands rests inside the cupped hands of an adult. Lying in the child's hands, a paper doll family, two parents with two children holding hands.
For those of you just joining us, we'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes here. We do have everyone muted and we'll start our presentation in just a moment. We're still moving everybody in from the waiting room to the live presentation. I see quite a few of you introducing yourself in the comments. Please feel free to go ahead and do that. We are thrilled that you all can join us this afternoon. We do have a large group, so it's just taking a minute to move everybody from the waiting room to the live presentation, but we'll get started here in just a minute. We still have folks coming in, so for those of you just joining us, we will start in just a moment. We do have all of our participants on mute today. We have a very large group, which we're thrilled about. It's just taking a minute to move everybody in from the waiting room. We'll just give it maybe one more minute and let folks come in from the waiting room. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Risk and Safety Assessment 101, brought to you by Child Welfare Information Gateway and sponsored by the Children's Bureau, Administration for Children and Families.
Housekeeping.
I'm Elizabeth Kramer. I'm with Information Gateway, and it's my pleasure to be facilitating today's webinar. Before we begin the presentation, just a few housekeeping items. Currently, all of our audio lines are muted except for our presenters. If you have a question or a comment, please enter it in the question box. We'll respond to questions at the end of the presentation. You're also welcome to share comments and resources in the chat box. I see quite a few of you have been introducing yourselves over there, and you're welcome to continue to do that. We are recording today's webinar, and we will make that recording available on the ACF YouTube channel in about 3 weeks. And finally, at the conclusion of today's webinar, we will be sending you a link to a webinar survey. Please take just about a minute and a half to complete that survey for us. We really do look at your responses and we rely on that input to inform our future webinar work. So please do give us some feedback on our work. I see a couple of you are asking about cameras. We have our cameras on just for our presenters today. Correct me if I am wrong, but I think that we do not have the audience. We have, just so you all know, about 550 people. So if everyone showed their camera, there would be no room for the slides. So it's just presenters on the cameras today. With that, Teresa, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you to get us started.
Bespectacled, gray-haired Teresa Costello, MA.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good afternoon or morning, everyone, whatever time zone you might be in. I'm Teresa Costello. I'm the CEO of Action for Child Protection. And I'd like to start by thanking the Children's Bureau for the invitation to make this presentation today. I'm excited to share with you what I know, what our experience has been in the realm of risk and safety assessment, and have a chance to maybe hear from you in terms of questions and some feedback from you. So a little bit about me and Action. I've been in the business for 38 years. Action was formed in 1984, and we are a nonprofit organization, and we do a lot of things, including program development, policy work. We do quality assurance. We do a lot of training. We, in particular, provide technical assistance and training on family connections, which is an evidence-based practice. But the thing that we are probably best known for is the work we've done to create the SAFE model, that stands for the Safety Assessment and Family Evaluation Model. It's a safety decision-making framework. And I'd like to, while you see this slide, you can see a picture of my staff. These are the people that I am privileged to get to lead. All excellent people doing great work out in our world. And just a little bit about we as Action, as an organization and in individuals, we are in this business because we believe that we can make a difference in the lives of children and families. If you go to our website, you'll see our tagline says, making quality child welfare practice possible. We really believe that. We believe that it's the right thing to do to work with agencies to create ways to make the practice of child welfare doable, to make it fair for families, to make it quality work that takes into account all the things that we should about families when we're making key decisions like what we're going to talk about today, safety and risk. So I hope that you join me. The reason why you're in this business is to also make a difference, and I hope that will come across today as we talk through what we're going to try to accomplish.
Objectives.
So we have our objectives. You probably saw these when you were signing up for the webinar. We want to do a few things. We want to make sure that we're very clear about what do we mean by the concepts of risk and safety. How are they similar or complementary, and how are they different? We want to talk about how do we make decisions and use these frameworks across the life of a case. And we also want to make sure that we have an understanding, at least at a basic level, about what are some of the most common practices. We're not going to look specifically at tools, any individual tool, but we're going to talk about some of the common tools that exist in the field and how they're used. So that's what we're going to try to accomplish. And we thought we'd start, before we get into the content, we wanted to launch a poll that will ask you a couple of questions so we can kind of get a sense of who our audience is today. So Tom, go ahead and launch that poll. We have 2 questions for you. We're interested in knowing in your agency if you're currently using some kind of a safety or risk framework. And we're hoping that we've got all the choices here. So if you could make your choices on that, that would be great.
A man monitoring the poll results chimes in.
And Teresa, we'll give folks a few minutes. Like
Okay.
Elizabeth said, we've got a lot of participants.
Teresa smiles.
Yes, thank you.
So we'll give folks just another few seconds to get an answer or two out there. All right, any last votes? Go ahead. All right, we're going to end this poll and I'm going to show the results.
Okay.
Teresa,
Okay, so it looks like we've got about 15% say they have a safety assessment tool, 4% risk, about 55% say both. Okay, that's great. Good to know. And then, of course, we've got some people that are not direct practitioners. So, okay. All right. And then we have a second question that we'd like to ask you. This one is, we're going to talk a bit about frameworks, protective capacities and protective factors frameworks, and how they tie into safety and risk assessment. So here we're interested in knowing in your practice if you're using either or both of these frameworks. So you have, again, this is a single choice. I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer this one.
the monitor speaks up.
All right, we'll leave this open for just a few more seconds here. And we ask you to get those last votes in. All right, thanks everybody for voting. And we're going to close this out. And Teresa, you can take a look at the results.
Teresa,
Okay, thank you. Yes. So it looks like we have 8 and 10% for protective factors, caregiver, protective capacities, and about 44% use both. About 9% don't have either. Great. Okay. So again, 44% both. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for participating in those polls. That will be helpful to us as we go through this. So what I'm going to try to do as I progress today is talk about some of the best practices.
key terminology, safety and risk.
Conversation, and I'm also going to, at the end, sort of highlight those best practices, if you will. So you'll hear some as we go, and you'll hear some at the end. But to get us started, thinking about terminology and these concepts, a key thing for us all to keep in mind is that the concepts of safety and risk are not intended to be interchangeable terms. Sometimes we hear them used interchangeably. Sometimes I hear people say things like, well, that's a safety risk. And what we're going to do today is hopefully make it very clear what the differences are. So just in the most simple terms, when we talk about risk in the context of child protective services, we mean the likelihood of future maltreatment. And when we assess for risk, we assess for it on a continuum from low to high. And I'm going to show you a visual in a minute that will help to kind of picture that. But that's the concept of risk, the likelihood of future maltreatment. When we think about safety and that concept, what we're talking about is immediate or impending danger or threats of serious harm. And when we assess for safety, we don't assess for it on a continuum, but we assess for it at particular points in time with our exact purpose of trying to determine whether a child is safe or unsafe.
On a slide, key concepts, safety and risk, a graphic of a risk continuum from low to high.
But I want us to start by looking at the bottom of this picture. And I want you to see the risk continuum across the bottom. And this will probably make good sense to you in the sense of how you think about risk in general, that when we assess for families and we think about those things that are likely to impact the likelihood of future maltreatment, things like parental stress, things like substance abuse, poverty, family violence, maybe a previous history of maltreatment, maternal depression, those kinds of things in any given family are likely to place a family at the right end of that continuum where they are at higher risk of maltreatment. The absence of those kinds of factors would place a family at the lower end of that risk continuum. So when we think about risk, we're thinking about understanding it as it progresses from a state of low risk to moderate risk to high risk. Sometimes we might even call it very high risk in certain instruments that are used. Now think about that and contrast that to the definition we just talked about of safety, which is immediate or impending threats of serious harm. So we use this picture to sort of impose on top of the risk continuum the idea that safety exists not across a continuum, but at a point in time when the family conditions reach a point where they cross what we call a threshold. You know what a threshold is, when they cross that threshold and we see what we will call impending danger threats. And I'm going to talk about these as we go on this afternoon. But the difference here is that in order for that condition, that family that we're assessing to reach that point where we cross that safety threshold, we have certain criteria that describe the safety threat that we're seeing. And it's what distinguishes something from a risk factor that exists along the continuum to a safety threat that's immediate, that's specific, that's observable. So we talk about the severity, we talk about the vulnerability of the children to that particular safety threat. It's a condition or a circumstance that's out of the control of the family. It's imminent, meaning it is likely to happen in the very near term. And it's observable. We can see it by looking at the behavior, the circumstances, the conditions in the family. So we're going to use these two concepts. We're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about how we assess them. But I want you to have in your vision how risk assessment, risk is along a continuum from low to high, and safety assessment is about the point in time when a condition or a circumstance or behavior crosses that threshold. That's where we talk about a child being safe or unsafe. And we're going to come back and we're going to talk some more about the other ideas that are on this picture. You'll see we talk about protective factors and we talk about protective capacities. And I'm going to work that into our presentation this afternoon.
What are the risks and safety assessments, and why do we use them?
The next thing we want to think about is, so why would we use these assessments? And one of the reasons, an important reason, is that CAPTA requires that every state has some way, some procedure in place for assessing for the immediate screening decision on a case and for assessing for safety and risk on cases and determining how quickly we need to initiate investigations. And that's exactly what safety and risk assessments do for us. They help us to determine, to distinguish, have we got a case that is at that point where we've reached that threshold and we need to take action. They help us to determine which families are higher risk and which families are lower risk. So CAPTA requires that. Also, this is a way for us to structure the assessment of information. We have a lot of people in this business doing the work. They come with different backgrounds, different training. We have to have some way to structure the information that we're going to collect about families, and we have to have some way to structure the way we're going to assess that family. We want families to be individualized, but we want there to be consistency, and we want there to be a minimal amount of bias or personal judgment that's brought into that case. We're not saying that we don't believe that an individual judgment impacts our decisions, but we want to have criteria and consistency in the process we use so that we can eliminate that as much as possible. The other thing is that we want to think about how do we use these concepts throughout the life of our child protection case. So the reason we got involved with a family because there were safety or risk concerns, that should be our criteria for also determining when we can get out of the life of a family. And really, if you come from a prevention framework, safety and risk assessments are a way of structuring our tertiary prevention. So families that are already known to our system, how can we do the best possible to prevent them from coming back again? So to, reduce our recurrence.
Today's view of safety and risk.
So what we're going to do is think about what are some of the common practices. As you know, there are different tools, there's different models out there, and I'm going to give you some references at the end that I encourage you to look at if you want more details. We can't possibly examine everything, so we're going to try to talk about what some of the more common frameworks are that exist and how we might understand those to help us understand these concepts today.
Safety assessment.
So I'm going to use a life of a case sort of process to think through this. So if you think about when cases come in and we begin to do our assessment with families, every single state at this point in time, I believe, has some way that they, through policy procedure, that they require that at that first face-to-face contact with the family, they're making a decision about whether that child is safe or not. In some jurisdictions, that's called present danger. And the idea of present danger in the italicized letters in the middle is that present danger is looking for immediate, significant, clearly observable family conditions. It could be an individual parent's behavior, it could be circumstances within that family, but they're conditions that threaten that child right at this moment. So the point in time when we are making the assessment, that first contact with the family. This is a key safety decision. It's the first one we make in the life of a case. And if present danger is identified, obviously we have to put a plan in place. We have to take action. Some of the kinds of things we see when we're talking about present danger, we might have a situation where we have an unexplained injury to an unexplained serious injury to a child. We might have an injury to the face or the head, some kind of life-threatening living condition, those kinds of things. Again, if you think about that idea of the threshold we talked about earlier, there are things that rise up and require immediate action. That's the first step in the life of a case, what we call the assessment of present danger.
Safety assessment process.
As the worker continues to gather information, they begin their investigative or assessment process, whatever you might call that. And we know that there are different protocols in different jurisdictions, but generally speaking, best practice tells us that, when we begin that first contact with the family, we want to see the child, we want to see other siblings in the family, we want to see others who reside in the home that may or may not be in a caregiving role. We obviously want to talk to the person who's responsible or has been alleged to be the maltreater in the case, and we want to talk to collaterals. So this information gathering process begins at the point of first contact, that present danger, but it proceeds through our investigative process. Different agencies have different amounts of time to complete these investigative processes, 30 days, 45 days, some states as much as 60 days. And it's the information that we're collecting here by this type of protocol that helps us to form our decisions about risk and safety. When we talk about information collection, we're not separating the information collection process for safety or for risk. We would do this simultaneously in the life of the case. That information is going to help us to inform both our safety and our risk decisions.
Sufficient information,
so this next
key
one
to decision making.
The idea that we have to have sufficient information. And this is the first thing that I would say, really call out as very important for best practice, that when we're gathering information to make safety and risk decisions, we have to have sufficient information about families. And that sufficient information, in many states, it's now organized by what we would call the 6 domains. And there are 6 categories of information that help us to understand the family. The first 2 make a lot of sense to us naturally because these are Child Protective Service referrals. We're talking about the extent of maltreatment, and we're also talking about surrounding circumstances. What were the circumstances that existed at the time that maltreatment occurred? The other 4 domains we believe are equally important, And I would encourage you to think if your family was reported to Child Protective Services, you would want them to know more about you than just what happened at the particular incident at the point in time that it occurred. So we talk about adult functioning, gathering information about all the adults that live in the home that are especially in caregiving roles, but we want to understand other adults that live in the home as well. We want to know about parenting practices generally, and we separate parenting practices and discipline from adults, from how they function as adults in this world, how they problem solve, how they make decisions. We want to know what their parenting practices are, what's their approach, what are their general ideas about parenting. We want to know about discipline particularly, and we want to know how they tailor discipline to the age of each child, those kinds of things. And the last category we talk about is child functioning. And this is very important, again, for every child that lives in the home. We want to gather sufficient information to understand that child on a daily basis, not just like what that child was like on the day that the allegation of maltreatment occurred, but what are they like on a regular basis? What are their peer relationships? How do they get along with their siblings or other children, those kinds of things. So this information is what we would call sufficient information, and we believe that it's a foundation of quality decision-making, and therefore it's a best practice, regardless of what model you're using, whether you're making a decision about risk or safety, that you must have sufficient information about families. It's what they deserve. It's the right thing to do.
Engagement is critical.
The next point I want to make is that information collection obviously is not easy, and it's not going to happen unless we have quality engagement. And so the way we go about engaging families is important. We like to think about a partnership with a family to get to know them, to understand their history, to understand their current circumstances, and that engagement process isn't just like one and done at first contact. It's something that begins at first contact and should continue through the life of the case, and must continue even if we're handing the case off to someone else, because that's the way our agency is structured. So very important. And we're seeing lots of good practices where agencies are using motivational interviewing techniques to be able to help their staff learn how to engage families in understanding that family, what it is that we need to know about them to make the best decision we can about safety or risk.
Best practice in safety assessment.
So as we go along, in terms of thinking about the life of a case, I already talked about the present danger, that very first decision we make at first contact. As we continue our investigative process and we gather more information in those domains that I mentioned, we come to a conclusion about impending danger. And impending danger, again, in the italicized paragraph in the middle, here we're looking at family conditions, circumstances, behaviors, could be the parent's perception, their emotions that are not within the family's ability to control and manage. And the key thing is that we have a vulnerable child, and the likelihood is that the consequence of these conditions or circumstances or behaviors is potentially severe. So again, going back to that early picture we looked at, when we cross that threshold where we have severe maltreatment likely and we have a vulnerable child, that's what we mean by impending danger. We've crossed that threshold where the behavior is no longer within the family's control. We make safety decisions at different points in time in the life of a case. We talked about present danger being at first contact, where we have limited information, but impending danger decisions at the conclusion of an investigation. All safety models that I'm aware of look again at the conclusion of an investigation to determine whether that child is safe based on a fuller understanding of all the information. All safety decisions, anything where we decide that a child is unsafe, require action to be taken. And we've already talked about the importance of sufficient information in order to make that determination.
Safety decisions and safety planning.
Common language that we find in reaching conclusions about safety, because obviously the most important thing about assessing for safety is not just calling it out and labeling it, but it's then taking action. So when we want to identify whether we've reached a decision that a child is safe, and that would mean that there's no present or impending danger threats, And that is due to, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, the presence of sufficient protective capacities. In contrast to that, the decision about unsafe, there are present or impending danger threats, and there are not sufficient protective capacities in that family. We also see, if you look at various jurisdictions, there is sometimes language that for safety decisions, and it uses language like safe with agreement or safe with a plan or conditionally safe. And that would mean present or impending danger threats exist, but protective interventions can be put in place. It's not the majority of states that use that language, but again, we're talking generally about safety assessment in our field. And so I wanted to mention that that is one of the ways that decisions are structured.
Caregiver protective capacities.
This is an important thing I wanted to talk about, and that's because in the definition that we just gave you, we talked about caregiver protective capacities. And this is a framework. We asked you in the polling question whether or not this is something that you're familiar with. So there's essentially a framework that structures the understanding about the caregivers people who are in a caregiving role in that family, their cognitive, behavioral, and emotional protective capacity. And this is understood and needs to be understood in the context specifically of safety. This is not about a broad understanding. We're going to talk a bit about protective factors later, but protective capacities are about the individual characteristics that a caregiver has that they use on a regular basis to keep their children safe. If you're a parent, if you've raised children, or you are raising children, or you've helped to raise somebody's children, you have demonstrated protective capacity that has kept a child safe. You have showed the knowledge and the understanding that's necessary to know what that child needs at whatever age they are. You have demonstrated action. You've taken those kinds of things to protect a child in any given situation in terms of supervision, who they have access to, who has access to them, who they're allowed to be with. You have had emotional protective capacity, the feelings, the attitudes, your identification and attachment with that child. Those are the things that we characterize in a safety model that really describe what's necessary to keep a child safe. And so in the slide that we talked about earlier, where we saw we were crossing over that threshold, when those protective capacities are missing in a caregiver, or they're not sufficient at that point in time, that's when we see children who are unsafe. So we use that concept. You're going to see that further as we go through this, but that's an important piece that ties directly to our understanding about safety in any family.
Safety plans.
So if we're thinking about progressing again through this life of a case, if we determine that there is impending danger, if a child is unsafe with the definition we just talked about, then a safety plan has to be developed. What are safety plans? Safety plans in most jurisdictions now are written agreements. Many times we have families sign them, and they're designed to control those immediate threats that we've identified. We've said that there's serious harm. We've identified specifically what it is. We've gathered a lot of information about the family. And so we come to an agreement about what a safety plan can be. Safety plans could be short-term. They could be voluntary. They could also be court ordered. There's different ways. We're going to talk a little bit about how they could be. But a very important thing about a safety plan is it should always be the least intrusive, minimally disruptive plan possible for that given family. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go further. Safety plans, in order to control an immediate threat that we've described, they have to be immediate. You can't be on a waiting list for something to happen. They have to be specific. We have to understand what the danger is that we're trying to control. They have to be sufficient. We've got to have enough. If it's supervision or it's separation of a parent from a child, we have to have a sufficient amount of that to fit the threat that we have. They also have to be feasible and sustainable. It has to be something that can continue. We don't know how long it's going to take to build up and work on the protective capacities, or to get to a point where we might be able to return a child home if we've had to remove them. So we have to have some kind of a a sense about the sustainability of our safety plan, given the realities of the present or impending danger threats. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to think through some of those. We want to be sure from a best practice point of view that we don't think that a safety plan is one size fits all. Safety plans always must be individualized. Again, if you believe in good social work values and practices, if we're going to individualize families, safety plans need to be individualized to specifically what that family needs at that point in time, and nothing more and nothing less.
Types of safety plans: in-home,
Types of safety
out-of-home.
plans, again, generalized, but there's different types. We characterize them as in-home, out-of-home, or potentially a combination. And again, an in-home safety plan, that's where the child is staying in the home, and we are providing different kinds of interventions that will allow that child to be there and be safe from whatever the danger threat is. We also have out-of-home safety plans. Out-of-home safety plans could be with relatives, they could be with fictive kin, and on sort of the most intrusive continuum, they would be in a foster placement. Safety plans can involve in-home and out-of-home actions. It could be that there's one child, given their age and or their vulnerability, that has to be removed from a home situation in order to stay safe, and there could be children within the home. It could also be that there's interventions that could be provided within the home, and there could be interventions that could be provided outside of the home for that child. So we want to be, again, if we're going to be good critical thinkers and have best practice and think about the least intrusive approach, we want to think about how could we possibly have a combination plan. I mentioned safety plans can be voluntary and they can be successful. If that's the case, one of the key best practices there would be that we have to understand the caregiver's willingness and ability to participate in that in-home safety plan. And many jurisdictions have a very thoughtful process of going through the consideration of what it would take to create an in-home safety plan successfully. And that includes the determination of the caregiver's capacity and willingness to participate.
Types of in-home safety plan interventions.
This is just and I won't read through all of these, but if you're creating in-home safety plans, we want to think about different ways, again, to do this. That, again, it's not one size fits all. So thinking about ways that we might tailor that. So you could have different kinds of behavior management. You could have crisis management. You might have a need for resource support. If you have a family where housing is the issue that's causing the child to be unsafe, whether it's unsafe housing or the lack of it. So the types of interventions should be tailored to the individual need that we've identified based on the impending danger identified and the status of the protective capacities in the home. The last thing we want to say here about safety plans is obviously the most restrictive kind of a safety plan we would be separation of the child from the parent. We've already talked about we want to avoid that if at all possible. So we go through a process of thinking of all the ways to keep a child safe at home. But if necessary, if the only way to do that is to remove the child, then placement away from the home would be what we would call an out-of-home safety plan. We think of placement is indeed a safety plan. Sometimes we hear people talking about the placement not in that context, but the child is unsafe and we make a decision that they have to be removed. That is the safety plan that we're operating on. Our goal is to move as quickly as possible to bringing that child home with an in-home safety plan. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward here. So again, thinking about the life of a case, that kind of takes us through at least the front end of the investigative or assessment process in most Child Protective Services case flows. And once we have
risk assessment,
the safety assessment has been completed, whether it's present danger assessment and an impending danger assessment, where we've come to a conclusion, we've made a determination, and this is going to be early in the life of the case, right? We're still in the investigative phase. Once that's completed, then it's the caseworker's job to thoroughly assess for risk. And when we think about risk assessment, again, we went in our earlier conceptual framework picture that we looked at, we talked about risk, looking at the likelihood of future maltreatment, understanding all of those, the information we've gathered in those 6 domains. We want to understand what is the likelihood of this of maltreatment occurring again within this family. And we want to also determine what services should be selected for this particular family, or provided or partnered with them to determine, what would be the best fit for them. And we want to not only know what services, we want to know what level, what's the frequency, and risk assessments can help us to determine that. So those are key pieces for why we would use a risk assessment. Some common components of risk assessment models. Frequently we see indices, and there are usually 2 different types of indices used, a neglect index and an abuse index. And regardless of the maltreatment that's been reported, a best practice would be that both of these indices are used. And just to give you a few examples, in a neglect index, it's common in one of the more commonly found risk assessment models. The ability of the parent or caregiver to provide consistent and appropriate care would be one of the items. Number of children in the home and their characteristics and needs. The caregiver's physical and mental health, and alcohol or other substance abuse in the family, and thinking about safe and stable housing. Those are factors that are used to assess for risk in a neglect index. In a abuse index, again, both are going to be used in all cases, but there's some similarities, some differences. The number of prior reports for abuse or neglect is one that we see, prior involvement with CPS, a history of childhood abuse or neglect, a current substance abuse problem, any history or evidence of domestic violence, significant problems with parenting skills, and a child with special needs or a history of delinquency. So those are factors that have been determined to help us understand, the right factors to help us determine what the likelihood of future maltreatment might be.
Risk level determination.
So in a risk assessment, in the actual assessment process, those items on those scales are scored, and they're totaled to provide a measure of the level of risk. Now, remember, we talked about earlier that in a risk assessment, we're measuring risk along a continuum. So scoring those items helps us to figure out where along the continuum would that family fall in terms of the likelihood of maltreatment. And you'll recall that we said in safety, we're not scoring things. And you saw in the description I just gave you about thinking about impending danger. We don't talk about where it exists on a continuum. We talk about when it crosses that threshold based on the criteria that we talked through. So that's again a key difference in the way these 2 frameworks, safety and risk, are structured, and the way in which they're applied in our work with families. In risk assessment, common language that's used, as I mentioned earlier, is low, moderate, high, or intensive, could be very high. And the level of risk, the reason why we give it a score is because it helps us to know about, again, the need for services and what resources are going to be necessary. So the higher risk families, the assumption would be that there would be a need for a higher level of service potentially in that particular family, because we're saying there are more risk factors that have risen to that higher level that cause that family to be determined to be at higher risk.
Assessment of family strengths and needs.
So again, moving through the life of the case, if we think we've progressed through the initial assessment of safety, the assessment of risk, and then we want to move into understanding. We've gathered a lot of information about the family, and we want to build on that information. We want to come up with good ideas, partnering with the family, about how can we create a service plan and identify the right needs, right services that would fit the family's needs. So there's different instruments that are used by different jurisdictions. looking at the behavior, the knowledge, the emotions, the skills that are going to be necessary to reduce both safety and risk. Our goal is to obviously reduce both of those, not just pick and choose which one we want to work on. And I've already mentioned there are a number of jurisdictions across the country that use the concept of the protective capacities that I already talked about, behavioral, cognitive, and emotional. That becomes a focus for many jurisdictions of this part of the process where we're looking for family strengths and needs. And that's structured in a way where we partner with the family to understand those and determine which ones would be the best to work on in terms of building that protective capacity. Another framework that's used that I want to be sure to mention because it's very important, and we have some resources for you at the end that will point out on this, is the protective factors framework that we see many jurisdictions using. And this is really a framework that looks at the conditions or attributes of caregivers, so individuals, of families, of communities, and really the larger society. And it's essentially a risk mitigation framework. When protective factors exist in a family, we see families in which children have healthy development, their well-being is positive. When we see the lack of these protective factors or the absence of these protective factors, we see the opposite. So in this assessment of strengths and needs that happens in the ongoing work of a case, we often see the use of a framework, the protective factors framework. And again, the goal is to help us to assess the needs in the family.
Safety and risk.
So I'm going to bring back this visual that I showed earlier, and this is where I want to just sort of overlay. We already overlaid, we talked about the risk continuum, we talked about the safety threshold and the point at which a family might, a family circumstance might cross that threshold. But I want you to think now about the idea of the protective factors that we just talked about. So you'll see along the bottom, right above the risk continuum, I have presence of protective factors on the left side and the absence of protective factors on the right side. It's really, that's how we show that the risk assessment concept and framework is related to the protective factors framework in the sense of concepts. They're bigger, they're larger, they're related to families at large, they're related to the community, they're related to individuals, obviously within that family. But both of those frameworks are complementary in the sense of understanding the risk in the family. And so when we see an absence of protective factors in families, we most often also see high risk, likelihood of maltreatment. If you move up in that picture, you'll see on the left-hand side, the caregiver protective capacities, which we've talked a little bit about. If you can think of those generally as strengths in families, when we see the presence of those protective capacities, we see safe children. When we see the lack of those protective capacities, moving to the right side of the picture, when the family has crossed that threshold and we see impending danger. So that's just to make the point and show you, reinforce the idea that these frameworks of safety and risk and protective capacities and protective factors, they all exist in the realm of our child protective services process and our business, but they have specific and different roles. Caregiver protective capacities are focused on individual behavior. Protective factors are focused on individuals and the family and the community. Safety is focused on the individual caregiver and the threat in that particular family. Risk has a broader context in terms of likelihood of maltreatment for that family at large. So they're related, they're conceptually complementary, but they're not the same. And so I hope that sort of helps to reinforce the idea that we want to use these concepts not interchangeably, but in a well understood way to help us conceptually think about the critical decisions that we're making with families and and how our tools, the instruments, the processes that our agency uses or is adopting, how they make sense to support that.
An ongoing assessment to evaluate progress on the service plan.
Again, important. We talk about everybody that I know in the risk or safety business talks about, assessing safety through the life of a case, thinking about making sure it makes sense, to when we would do that. So we know that at every contact that a worker has with a family, they are going to be informally assessing for safety and risk. They're going to be paying attention to any changes in that family, any dynamics that may be different. But we also see that there are specific times when jurisdictions call for reassessments and evaluating, essentially to evaluate progress on the life of a case. And we do that because we're wanting to see if we have set in place a plan to work with a family to, for example, enhance caregiver protective capacities. We want to make sure we're evaluating the achievement of those so that we can move ourselves towards closure. So that becomes really it reflects our theory of change about families, that if we can build the protective capacities, we can assure the safety of the children in the long run, and then Child Protective Services will not have to be involved with that family.
Formal safety or risk reassessments.
We see through the life of cases, and you'll see in some of the resources that we're going to give you, you can look at policies and procedures where there are formal times when safety and risk are reassessed. In many states utilize reassessment instruments. They are completed at key intervals in the life of a case. They might be required, for example, assessing safety before a family transitions from supervised visitation to unsupervised visitation. Before return of a child to the custody of their parents, we see jurisdictions assessing using safety instruments. If there's a significant event in the life of a case, a new child is born or some circumstance, a new caregiver comes into the role in that family. And we often see a requirement for safety reassessments before court reviews happen so that the worker is talking, providing current information about the status of safety in that particular case.
Risk reassessments.
And we also see risk reassessments at key intervals. And we have a couple slides here where we can see, obviously, there's a logic to the reason why we're reassessing for risk, which again is our likelihood of future maltreatment. We're going to look for some of those things that were those indicators that we used earlier on. So we're looking for how the parent is doing with any parenting skills currently. We're going to look for relationships and any concern about any harmful relationships currently in that reassessment. We're going to look for use of substances at the point in time that we're assessing. We're going to look if there's been any new reports about the family. We're going to want to understand that, and obviously we're going to look to see how the family and the caregivers in particular are making progress and participating in the case plan that was designed to reduce those risk factors that we had identified. In best practice, in terms of risk assessment, we see that we would take items from the original risk assessment, but also some new items are brought in there. They're typically completed on open treatment cases. They're completed for children who've been in the home for some period of time, already been reunified. There's different intervals when assessments are required. Frequently, it's about 90 days from the time of the service plan to the reassessment of the risk. And every jurisdiction has flexibility in the sense of if something new circumstances happen, you might determine that it's important to do a risk assessment at a different interval.
Assessment for reunification.
And then the last thing we want to talk about, that's two things, reunification and closure. Again, thinking about moving along the life of a case. Reunification is a key decision in the life of a family. And it's, we believe that it ought to be based on an understanding about safety, that we remove children because we already talked earlier about that they're unsafe, and that at the point in time when we can move them home, we should be doing so. And so there are differences in the ways that jurisdictions use assessments for reunification. I already mentioned some are done for if a child has been placed out of home and they're going to be reunified. Frequently, we'll see a safety assessment completed. Sometimes they're used to determine if the current conditions in the home, have changed. And again, we use if the family hasn't progressed to reunification, the best we can do is use circumstances we can observe during visitation to determine whether reunification is going to be recommended. But an alternative approach I want to talk about for just a minute is this idea of reunification and the incorporation of the conditions for return. This is a concept that we introduced quite a few years ago, and I believe is really important if we're going to be making progress in our field about getting children home as soon as possible. And so the idea is that as you're assessing for safety early on in the life of a case, and if you reach the determination that the child has to be removed, we talked about that, the efforts that you'll make to do, reasonable efforts. But if the child has to be removed at that point in time, we believe it's important to establish conditions for return that would describe what it would take to get a child home with an in-home safety plan. That's important, and that's different than what we see in current practice in many jurisdictions. Frequently, we see that the criteria for return is completion of the case plan. The case plan is off all those services, those things that are treatment, that may take longer. If we have parents that have substance abuse problems or mental health issues, that kind of change could take some time. So we, in the approach that we take with safety, and many jurisdictions are using now, is to define what it would take to get a child home with an in-home safety plan. So it's essentially stepping down from an out-of-home plan to an in-home plan is the idea. Again, I think it's very important if we're going to make progress in moving children to reunification as soon as safely possible.
Assessment for case closure.
And then the last thing I want to talk about is case closure. And that obviously the reason why we work with families, we hope we can get to a point where we can safely close cases. And many jurisdictions use reassessments before they make that decision about case closure. They can look at the level of risk, they can look at those circumstances, the safety threats that existed at the point that the case was opened or the child was removed, and have those been eliminated. And then we've already talked about the idea of looking for how we've made progress to enhance those caregiver protective capacities so that we can feel confident in closing the case. So that really talks through the life of a case, how we use safety and risk decisions or structures to guide that process. I don't think I said it earlier, but I meant to, that one of the key things that I would say as a practitioner in this field for a long time is that in order for assessment instruments to be effective, they have to be used. And so it's very important that as safety assessments tools are introduced and they're built into, SACWIS or CWIS systems, same thing for risk assessment, they have to be used to guide decision-making and not simply to document decision-making. If they're used after the fact, just to show what you did, then it's not clear how that process guided your decision-making. As you can see from some of the criteria we've talked about, the idea of understanding thresholds, understanding definitions, being good critical thinkers about the two concepts, there's guiding criteria in all of the models that are essential to use. So just important that as practitioners, we use them the way they're intended to be used, or they'll never serve the purpose that they've been set out to serve.
Summary, best practices.
Last slides here, and then we'll talk about resources and see if we have any questions. In summary, I put some things up here about best practices. Sufficient information is what's right and important. Every family deserves us that we know them well enough to make these key decisions. I believe present danger should be made early in the life of the case, but it should not determine. I talk about the trajectory of the case. If we make a decision on day one that a child has to be removed based on present danger, we must come back throughout our investigative process when we've gathered more information and determine if that decision has to stay that way, or is it possible, based on a better understanding about the family and really understanding impending danger, not just what we knew on that first day, that we could make a less intrusive decision about that. So very important. Best practice requires we think of it both ways, impending danger and present danger. Caregiver protective capacities are key to understanding impending danger. It's not enough to just know what the threat is. We have to understand what the caregivers who live in that home, who provide daily parenting and protection of those children, what is their capacity to participate in keeping that child safe. Key concept. Safety plans should be least intrusive. We've talked about that. I just got through talking about conditions for return should be established at the point of removal, and they ought to define what it would take to get a child home with an in-home safety plan. And then a few more best practices. Sometimes we see a concept of safety plans being family managed. That makes me nervous because by definition, if a child is unsafe, then we have said that the family is not able to manage that at this point in time. So characterizing safety plans as family managed, to me, it's inconsistent with the concept of safety. Risk and safety are not the same. I hope we've pointed that out here today and help you understood that a little bit better. But it's important to know that if you're a practitioner, how are they different? And how's each used and at what point in time? And how does it help me as a child protective services practitioner to make the best right decision for any given family? Risk assessments measure for all types of maltreatment. Regardless of what's reported, we have to think about both abuse and neglect if we're going to use risk assessment tools accurately. They should guide our decision about opening a case for services. And the last point here about best practices is both frameworks, the protective factors framework can guide our understanding about risk. We talked about it being a risk mitigation kind of a framework, and protective capacities guide our decisions about safety. So they're not, they're compatible, complementary kinds of frameworks that can be used in our business.
Resources.
At the end here, I promised that we would give you some resources if you'd like to study any of this some more. You can see these. There's a really nice document the Capacity Building Center did on safety outcomes and decision-making approaches. They call it a showcase. It's very informative. There's one that the Child Welfare Information Gateway has out, the use of safety and risk assessment in child protection cases. A lot of great detail in there, not only about laws or statutes, but also policies. They brought in some things that come from rules and regulations in different jurisdictions, a great source of information. There's a couple of resources here related to the protective capacities and protective factors. There's reference to a webinar that was done a few years ago that talks about both frameworks and how they are compatible. And then there's also a infographic that was put out by the Capacity Building Center for States that is helpful in understanding the two frameworks. And then the last resources, there's a protective factors approaches in child welfare, again, from the Gateway. That's an issue brief that's very informative. And there's a Spanish resource that's the protective factors for strong families that is available through the Gateway. So I think all of these are relevant to the content that we've talked about today and might be additional resources that you might like to access. So I think that's it for my presentation, and I believe we are going to move in to a Q&A.
Blonde Kara Kelly.
Great, thanks so much, Teresa. All of your lines continue to be muted. However, if you have specific questions, if you can go ahead and enter them into the Q&A box, we're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. We already have a number of really great questions that a lot of you have already entered. So beginning with the first question, Teresa, there's a couple here just around clarifying some of the content. How does impending danger differ from risk?
Teresa Costello.
Okay. So I think the simplest way to think about that is that risk, when we think about risk, characterizes the overall likelihood of maltreatment. And again, we talked about existing on a continuum. So you could go from low risk to high risk, and impending danger. We want to think about that at the conditions, circumstances in a family where it would cross that threshold, where it would be severe, you have a vulnerable child, you have immediacy, you have conditions that are out of the control of the family, and so that you have to take some immediate action. There could be situations where obviously you have impending danger and you have high risk, and some of the circumstances that you might see, for example, there could be domestic violence that's contributing to a child being in impending danger, and that domestic violence is also going to contribute to our assessment of the likelihood of future maltreatment. So I think what sometimes gets us confused, or just questioning the concepts, is the conditions that contribute to those two concepts may be similar in families, but the action that we take as professionals who have to respond need to differentiate whether something is indeed an impending danger, it's immediate and it's potentially severe and therefore requires an action, versus that it's a factor that helps us to understand the risk in a family.
Kara.
Okay, thank you. That was really helpful. The next question here is related to this one. How do you discern the difference between high or very high risk and crossing the threshold for unsafe? What does that look like for a family?
Teresa Costello.
Well, I guess, in terms of the characterizing high and high risk, again, it would be different risk assessment tools that sort of structure this process. But just conceptually, if you think about the greater the number of the factors that are contributing to the risk in that family, the higher the risk is going to be. So if you have a family that has many of those factors, you're likely to have high or cross that point on the continuum where you would say you have very high. And again, the threshold for determining safety, how that's going to look for a family. I'm not sure if you're asking from the family's perspective, but these are going to be, again, conditions within that family that are not within their control. And it could be, like I said, it could be a mental health condition of a caregiver. It could be substance abuse. It could be even environmental kinds of things where you've got families living in a home where the family is, it's a meth lab where they live or something. That's really an extreme example, but that's a condition or a circumstance that's out of the control of the family, in the sense of the potential for the place to be dangerous and make an immediate threat to their child. So again, the conditions that you would assess to determine whether you have high or very high risk and or impending danger could be the very same conditions, but your understanding of what you need to do and the action you're going to need to take what might be different if you're clearly distinguishing impending danger from an assessment of risk.
Kara.
Is poverty really a risk factor or a contributor to risk factors?
Teresa Costello.
Well, that's a good question. I would say that poverty is a contributor to risk factors. I mean, we know that there are, a family that is living in a situation in which there's poverty is going to have perhaps greater stress. They're going to have, additional impact on them in terms of looking for resources and supports. It doesn't it's not any reflection on their parenting capacity. It's not necessarily any reflection on their decision making or any of those kinds of things that we'd be taking into account. So again, it could be understood as a factor that has to be, again, individualized for each family in terms of how it's manifesting, what are the circumstances. So I think that is a good distinction that the person that asked that question asked.
Kara.
So you talked a little bit about bias earlier in the presentation. So speaking of this question related to poverty, do you have any suggestions for workers in ways to become more aware of their own individual biases about poverty and other situations involving families when they're conducting an assessment?
Teresa.
I think that's a great question. And I think that applies to, you're asking it specifically in terms of bias related to poverty, but I think it's an important question for bias in general in our business. The best thing I can tell you is that what we encourage is that jurisdictions are, one, thoughtful about who they're bringing in, the selection criteria for staff that are going to do this work. We would want them to be, have good values and be open to, thinking uniquely about every family and not coming in with a preconceived idea about any given family based on any kind of condition, including poverty. I would say also that we find from practice that supervision is critical to quality decision making. And like, for example, just in describing these risk and safety assessment processes, there will be criteria for assessing a family's living conditions. And those could reflect a condition of poverty. But how that is understood and assessed in terms of how it contributes or doesn't contribute to risk, how does it contribute or not contribute to an understanding of impending danger is really important. And, we've seen plenty of cases where you have adequate caregiver protective capacity, behaviorally, cognitive, emotionally, and caregivers that are working really well to keep their children safe and, in spite of living in a condition of poverty. So it just has to be individualized. It has to be thoughtful, use the criteria, quality supervision. I think any efforts that agencies can make to work on where workers are challenged to think about their bias on a regular basis under any circumstance, I think those are all very important efforts.
Kara.
So related to the issue of bias, are there any practice tips that you can provide for risk and safety assessments through a lens of cultural competency?
Teresa.
Well, I think a lot of what I just said, I think would apply in terms of, cultural competency, understanding, again, each individual family that comes to the attention of Child Protective Services comes from their own unique cultural background, their current cultural context. And as decision makers, we owe it to them to do our best to understand that and take that into account as we make our decisions, as we gather information, as we take our criteria and apply it, individually to that particular family. So I would say the same kinds of things that in response to the question, particularly about poverty, would apply in a cultural context. I think agencies should and most, I believe, do have adequate training about cultural competency. Another thing I like to think about from a worker perspective is the idea of cultural humility. And that is that you, as the worker entering this family, if you're going to partner with them to understand them and figure out how you can help them, how you can understand if their children are safe or unsafe, if there's what the level of risk is, what services might be appropriate. If you can approach that from, you don't know their family, they can help you to understand their family and their culture and their context and their, circumstances on a day-to-day basis. That's, I believe, just a great social work practice that is going to set you up not only for a good relationship, but for making the best decision in partnership with that family.
Kara.
Next question we have here is, what does risk and safety assessment look like if the child is the aggressor?
Teresa.
Well, so the context I would think about that. So if the child is the aggressor I'm assuming in the family situation, because in order for it to be in a child protection, to have been reported to Child Protective Services, the assumption would be that it's within the family. And the first way I would think about that is obviously understanding the need, if there's a need for protection of other family members from that child, you would use the same kind of thinking about present danger. What is that? How is that child's behavior threatening maybe a sibling or a family member? So in terms of intervention to protect, you want to think about the present danger that child might present. When you get into the broader decision-making process that we talked about with the domains, a key piece would be thinking about the parent's role. The parent has a role and a responsibility to parent that child and to do the best they can to supervise and protect the children in that situation. And in terms of long-term ability to keep all the children in that family safe, we'd be thinking about the protective capacities of the caregivers to parent that child successfully and protect, themselves or the children within that home. So I don't think it's necessarily a different framework. It's just how do we take into account the immediate needs to protect the family from a present danger point of view, but also understanding from a larger frame for that family, how the parents can be successful in their parenting role in the long term, parenting that child who has maybe these aggressive behaviors.
Kara.
And we have a couple questions here related specifically to safety plans. We had a couple participants ask what the difference was between informal and formal safety plans.
Teresa.
Okay, formal and informal. Well, that's a good question. I think there are jurisdictions that use the concept of an informal safety plan. And what I would say is that if an informal safety plan is one where there's not, the agency doesn't have oversight of it. So in some way, if the family is similar to what I referenced earlier as a family managed safety plan, that I would be cautious about those kinds of plans, because if we've determined that the child is unsafe and then we have an informal plan or a family managed plan to try to control that, it's really sort of inconsistent with what we've determined to be the need or the danger that needs to be controlled. So generally speaking, I think from a best practice point of view, safety plans should be formalized. And by that, I mean in the sense that they are, the agency is taking the lead to create it can still be a partnership with the family to create it, especially if it's an in-home safety plan, but it's got to be formalized in the sense that everybody who's a part of it understands what their role is, what the frequency, if we have, a grandma who's going to meet the child every day after school and take care of that child for a couple of hours, because that was the time in which the child was alone and was determined to be unsafe. That would be a formal plan, and we would make sure that grandma understands what her role is, as long as we, meaning the Child Protective Service Agency, are involved. So I don't know if that answers that question or not, but.
Kara.
Also related to safety plans here, when you say a safety plan being family managed, who do you consider family? Do you mean that the parent should not manage other family members who have or may have not stepped up prior to child welfare involvement? So I think that question is just really getting at further clarifying what you mean by family managed in terms of these safety plans.
Teresa.
Yeah. So the point I was making about family managed is, if we, and I mean this from, if the Child Protective Service Agency is saying to the family that they can manage that plan without the involvement of the agency, in a sense, that's where I would exercise caution, because if we're saying the child is unsafe and yet we're saying the family can manage it, we're really contradicting ourselves. We've said that they couldn't manage it, that's why the child's unsafe, and yet managing it. But I would distinguish that from the idea that we want family members involved in formal safety plans that we are creating. Families have excellent capacity and understanding and ability and willingness to participate in in-home safety plans for families. So having a family be involved in that is possible. It just, the point I was trying to make is that it should be formalized in the sense that everyone understands what their roles are, and we aren't just turning it over and saying, the child is unsafe, but the family, you go ahead and figure it out on your own. That to me is the danger of not having adequate oversight of a safety plan.
Kara.
Related also to safety plans here, that there have been a number of class action lawsuits related to safety plans. Do you have an opinion as to when safety plans violate parents' due process rights?
Teresa.
Well, I believe that parents obviously have due process rights, and that as decision makers, safety is an important decision. As I said, if we're determining that the child is immediate or impending threats of serious harm, and we're putting in a plan, that we have to be specific about what that plan is, and to the best of our abilities, we have to be have a good understanding about not necessarily a guarantee of how long it's going to last, but what are the conditions that we're trying to control, and making sure that all the people that are going to participate can participate for the amount of time necessary. I understand if we are telling parents they can't have access to their children, that they're we're limiting their rights. Probably the lawyers would say that's something we need to have, that needs to be we need to seek legal action in order to make sure that we're doing that. So I mean, we see agencies that use do get court oversight for safety plans where they are limiting the contact that a parent can have with a child. So I think that each jurisdiction needs to be thoughtful about that. I think it could be a slippery slope if we're doing anything informally to limit a parent's access to their child. If that's crosses the legal threshold we should get our own legal advice from the folks that represent us in the child protective arena on that.
Kara.
And the next few are related specifically to the SAFE model. The first one is, are there actual forms for safety and risk assessments that are used with SAFE?
Teresa.
So SAFE is just a safety decision-making model. So yes, there are forms, plenty of them in the SAFE model that structure the process of gathering information, the assessment, present and impending danger through the whole life of a case. There's a whole series of forms. SAFE is not does not incorporate risk assessment into the decision-making process.
Kara.
In risk assessments that you know of, is there a psychological abuse index in any of them?
Teresa.
I am not aware of that. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but that is not something that I have ever come across. I would encourage the Evident Change, which has done a lot of work on risk assessment, and you can find reference to them in the showcase document that I talked about. They might be good to ask that question. I haven't seen that.
Kara.
And so related to this idea of these surveys for protective factors, are there any surveys available to determine an increase or a decrease in protective capacity in parents pre and post service delivery?
Teresa.
That was about protective capacities, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So again, the protective capacities is a concept that's in the SAFE model. And we have a couple jurisdictions that have done different things with scaling the protective capacities and assessing them from at the point in time that we begin our intervention, if you will, in the sense of concluding impending danger, understanding protective capacities, and then we work with the family through the ongoing part of the case to build up those protective capacities and do a progress assessment to see how we're doing. And those instruments actually are in the process of going through some inter-rater reliability work currently. So anybody that might be interested in seeing any of these things that you're, particularly asked about SAFE, I'd be happy to share things with you if you want to contact me.
Kara.
Okay, so I think we've reached the end of our Q&A period. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Elizabeth for closing.
Elizabeth Kramer.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kara. And I just want to take a minute to thank you, Kara, and the Children's Bureau for sponsoring this first webinar, which is part of a 3-webinar series related to risk and safety assessment. And certainly also very special thanks to Teresa, our presenter today. You have covered so much information. I feel like, when we think of a 101, we really think of a semester long class. And I think that's what you've managed to provide for us in 90 minutes, which is very impressive. For our audience, this is the first of 3 webinars that we're offering related to risk and safety assessment. Our second one, Strengthening Casework Practice Related to Risk and Safety Assessment, will be on August the 17th. And then How Issues of Race, Equity, and Diversity Impact Risk and Safety Assessment will be on September 27th. We will be sending out registration emails for those shortly, so be watching out for them. Several of you have asked, I will be sending out shortly after this webinar a PDF of the slide presentation for today and a link to our webinar evaluation. And again, I just really encourage you all. I know sometimes we all fill out surveys and wonder if anyone's actually looking at them. We are actually looking at them. We do really make good use of the information to inform our future work. And I think it was input from past surveys indicating that this was a real need that people had for education that led us to develop this series. So please take a few minutes of your time and give us feedback on this. Again, very sincere thank you to the Children's Bureau and especially to you, Teresa, and thank you to all of us for joining us today. This has been a really rich and wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.